I'm Annie. Standing in the center of this old kitchen in Red Hollow, Kentucky, I'm holding a sterling silver pocket watch in my hand. The engraving on the inside cover, "To my Savior in Eternal Gratitude," catches the dim light and seems to glow with a story I'm just beginning to understand. This watch might be the key to saving my son Eli's life, a life that's been hanging in the balance for far too long. It all started when I received a call from a probate attorney in Nashville. I was standing at the kitchen counter, sorting through another stack of unpaid medical bills, with Eli fussing in my arms and the girls restless from being cooped up indoors. The attorney, Mr. Benjamin Clark, told me about an inheritance from a distant relative named Zena Thompson. I barely remembered her, a woman I'd met once at a long-ago family gathering. But she'd named me and my children in her will and left us her family home in Red Hollow. The news was like a bolt from the blue. I was drowning in debt, with 5 children to care for and Eli's life-saving surgery costs seeming like an insurmountable mountain. The house in Red Hollow was fully paid for, a roof over our heads that I wouldn't have to pay rent for. It was a glimmer of hope in the midst of my despair. That night, after the children were asleep, I spread the legal documents across the kitchen table. Next to the ugly numbers of medical bills, rent notices, and utility balances, there was the scanned deed for a house I'd never expected to inherit. I knew we had to move. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it was our only chance. The drive to Red Hollow was long and arduous. The aging minivan bumped along winding back roads, through miles of forest and open fields. The rain turned the gravel paths into thick mud, and the children grew restless. By the time we finally reached Willow Bend Road, exhaustion had seeped into every bone in my body. But when the house came into view, I caught my breath. It sat on a small rise, surrounded by tall trees. The paint was weathered and the porch boards were uneven, but there was a sense of endurance about it. The narrow chimney stretched upward like an old spine, and the wide windows reflected the soft gray sky. I parked beside the porch, unbuckled Eli and Noah from their car seats, and stepped onto the creaking boards with a mix of hope and fear. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and age, but there was also a warm, comforting undertone. The front room was filled with antique furniture, a carved oak table, and a rocking chair polished smooth by years of use. Portraits of unfamiliar faces lined the walls, each one a chapter in the Thompson family history. I moved into the kitchen and set the twins in their portable bassinets. As I started to clean, determined to make the place livable before nightfall, my hand brushed against something cold and metallic on the top shelf of a worn pine cabinet. It was the silver pocket watch. I picked it up, surprised by its weight. The cover was smooth, etched with delicate scrollwork. When I opened it, the hands were frozen at a precise time, and the face was slightly yellowed with age. But it was the engraving on the inside cover that stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't help but wonder who had gifted it, who had received it, and why it had been tucked away so neatly. That night, I was awakened by a loud, insistent knocking on the door. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the lace curtains. I held my breath, fear rooting me in place. We were miles from town, surrounded by forest and empty fields. But then I noticed that the children were sleeping peacefully, as if the house had been silent all along. I stood up slowly, pulling my sweater tight around me as I crossed the creaking floorboards. The knocking came again, this time gentler. When I opened the door, a thin, elderly man stood on the porch. His gray hair hung in wisps beneath a worn hat, and deep lines traced his face. But his eyes were clear, steady, and strangely familiar. "Evening, Miss Annie," he said kindly. "I'm Isaiah Thompson. This was my family's home long before your great-aunt Zena took care of it. I thought I'd stop by to see how you and the little ones were settling in." I was stunned. The name Isaiah Thompson struck a chord in my memory. I remembered seeing a sepia photograph in an album upstairs labeled Isaiah Thompson, 1965. The man in the photo had the same kind eyes and gentle warmth as the one standing in front of me. But that was impossible, the photo was decades old. I invited him in, and as he entered, the house seemed to come alive. He sat at the old wooden table, and I boiled water for tea. When I placed the tea in front of him, he wrapped his fingers around the mug and said, "You found the watch, didn't you?" I froze. "Yes, I did." He nodded, his gaze gentle. "That silver piece has traveled a long way. Back in 1945, a man almost lost his little girl to the river's current. I pulled her out just in time, and her daddy gave me that watch with tears in his eyes. He said it was for a savior, but I never thought of myself as one. You see, things like that don't stay with us forever. They move where they're needed. That watch wasn't meant to gather dust in a drawer. It was meant to save another innocent life someday." I felt my throat tighten. I couldn't speak, afraid my voice would break the fragile calm in the room. Isaiah went on to tell me stories of the Thompson family, of corn harvests, winter storms, and weddings in the backyard. His words were like a warm blanket, soothing me in a way I hadn't felt in years. Somewhere between his stories, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, my neck was stiff from sleeping upright at the kitchen table. The room felt strangely warm, as if someone had tucked a blanket around the whole house while I slept. But when I looked at the opposite chair, it was empty. Only my half-finished cup of tea sat there, cooling in the morning air. The other mug hadn't been touched. I stepped out onto the porch. The cool morning air brushed my face, and the smell of damp earth filled my lungs. I looked at the path from the front steps to the bend in the trees. There were no footprints, no tire marks, no sign that anyone had approached the house. A shiver ran down my spine. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic to find the photo album. And there he was, in the sepia photograph labeled Isaiah Thompson, 1965. The man in the picture was unmistakable. I closed the album slowly, my fingers trembling. Just then, a knock on the door startled me. I hurried downstairs and opened the door to find a woman in her late 60s standing on the porch, holding a freshly baked pie. "Well, good morning," she said warmly. "You must be Annie." "I'm Evelyn Harris, your neighbor down the road. I thought I'd bring you a little welcome-to-town treat." I managed to smile, still shaken. As we talked, she mentioned the old silver watch that had gone missing after Zena passed. "Isaiah's watch," she said. "He got it back in the 1940s after saving that landowner's daughter." Such a story. Of course, Isaiah's been gone for decades now. I was just a girl when he passed. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Decades. He'd been gone for decades, yet I'd spoken to him last night. Evelyn returned the following afternoon with a basket of preserves. As we sat at the kitchen table, she started talking about the Thompson family's long history in Red Hollow. "You know," she said, "there are a few legends around this house, especially about Isaiah. People say he never really stopped watching over the family. He was a kind soul, he never wanted anyone to feel unsafe under this roof." I stared at her, my breath caught in my throat. "I think I might have felt that," I whispered. She smiled knowingly and pulled out an old clipping from a local historical newsletter. "Thought you'd want this story about that silver watch of his." I unfolded the paper carefully. The article described an incident from the 1940s. A wealthy landowner's daughter had fallen into the river during a summer picnic. Isaiah had dived in after her without hesitation, nearly losing his own life to the current. The father, overwhelmed with gratitude, had presented him with the handcrafted sterling silver pocket watch engraved with the same words I'd seen, "To my savior in eternal gratitude." Evelyn said softly, "It was priceless even back then, not just emotionally but monetarily too. A piece like that, sterling silver, custom engraving, craftsmanship from that era, it's worth a small fortune today, maybe more." My voice wavered. "More? How much more?" "Well," she said, leaning back thoughtfully. "A serious antique dealer, one who understands what this watch is, might pay enough to put a child through college or cover something important. Eli's surgery." The room came into sharp focus. All the bills I'd agonized over, the sleepless nights I'd spent crying quietly so the children wouldn't hear, the hopelessness that had buried me for months, it all collided with one truth. The watch was the miracle. Isaiah had come not to frighten me, but to guide me toward the very thing he once promised, a saving. I exhaled a long, trembling breath. Evelyn reached across the table and touched my hand. Sometimes, honey, things find their way to the people who need them most. As she left, I stood in the center of the kitchen, looking at the watch in the drawer. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow, I would contact an antique appraiser in Louisville, a reputable dealer who specialized in heirlooms of significant historic value. I would take the watch, secure the funds, and schedule Eli's surgery. That night, after the children fell asleep, I stepped onto the porch. The moon hung low between the trees, silver and soft. I felt a presence, not frightening, but reassuring, as if someone stood quietly nearby. "Thank you, Isaiah," I whispered into the cool air. No wind answered, no voice replied, but the house seemed to settle around me, peaceful and protective, as though acknowledging my gratitude. Now, looking back on my life, it's been a long and difficult journey. I was born to a young and irresponsible mother, Lily. She was only 18 when I was born, and she had no idea how to be a parent. Our small apartment in Memphis was always cluttered and noisy. She treated motherhood as a burden, feeding me out of obligation rather than love. It wasn't long before my grandmother, Martha, stepped in. She was a stern, practical woman in her 50s, shaped by a lifetime of hard work. She adopted me because she was certain that Lily would lose custody, and she didn't want me to end up in the foster care system. In Martha's home, I had food, clean clothes, and safety, but affection was a luxury. She believed that praise made children soft and comfort led to entitlement. There were no bedtime stories, no celebrations, and no spontaneous hugs. As I grew older, the emotional gap between us widened. When I was in middle school, my grandfather, Robert, died suddenly from a heart attack. He had been the only source of warmth in that cold house. After his death, Martha became even more rigid, and I shrank into myself. I learned to stay quiet, to avoid mistakes, and to keep my emotions hidden. Adolescence was a quiet time for me. I blended into the background at school, never drawing attention to myself. I had no space to be loud or to express myself. I lived in a world defined by obedience, a world where I had no choices. But then I met Tom in community college. He was a warm-eyed, soft-spoken young man who noticed me when no one else did. He sat beside me in the computer lab and started a conversation. He asked about my major, my interests, and my plans. I was startled that someone actually cared. Our relationship grew slowly but steadily. We went on our first date when the campus Wi-Fi crashed and class was cancelled. We went to a nearby diner, and I laughed, really laughed, for the first time I could remember. We got married and settled into a small apartment in Memphis. Tom took a job as a long-haul trucker to give us stability. We had our first daughter, Amy, and then 2 more, Bella and Cora. Our home was filled with love and laughter, a far cry from the coldness of my childhood. Then, the twins, Eli and Noah, were born. For a few days, everything was perfect. But within weeks, we noticed that Eli wasn't doing well. He was breathing too fast, too hard, and he tired quickly. The doctors diagnosed him with a severe congenital heart defect, a condition that required specialized surgery available only in major medical centers. The cost estimates were staggering. Even with Medicaid coverage, the out-of-pocket expenses, travel, lodging, and post-operative care were more than we could afford. Tom promised that we'd figure it out. He picked up extra routes, and we saved every dollar we could. But then, the unthinkable happened. One Tuesday morning, Tom kissed me goodbye before dawn and left for work. I was soothing a fussy Eli back to sleep when the phone rang. It was the State Highway Patrol. There had been an accident, and Tom had died at the scene. I was left alone with 5 children and a mountain of medical bills. I had no idea how I was going to pay for Eli's surgery. I applied for every assistance program I could find, but it was never enough. Hope slowly eroded, and despair set in. But now, holding this watch in my hand, I feel a glimmer of hope. It might not be victory yet, but it's a start. For the first time in years, I allow myself to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday.